Control your prospect engagement process. We're going to cover in this module your process versus their process, your process for selling versus your prospect's process for buying, where your process can oftentimes break down and you can lose control, and how all of these things can really help you shorten your sales cycles. Control your prospect engagement process. Have you guys ever experienced working really hard on a big, rushed, gotta happen now RFP, and then all of a sudden things stall? You don't hear back. You're not quite sure where things are. They say, "Oh yeah, things have changed. We're not quite sure when we're going to get to that." Or oftentimes where your prospect will ask you right up front for pricing, for some information, for you to send them some things. Then you go ahead and do that. You send a proposal, you send some pricing or some stuff, and then you don't hear back. Or your contact at some level blocking you from talking to all the decision makers. We've talked about this process and some key questions you can ask. It's often very natural for your prospect to try to protect other decision makers. They don't want to look bad. They don't want to waste their time. They're not sure what you're going to do once you get to them, or their ego wants to look good and wants to protect themselves and deny you from talking to all the other people. So this whole series and a couple of the reminders here is really designed to do a better job of focusing on these things and better controlling the process. So their process. So your prospect or client's process could be generally defined as it's rational, it's logical. Typically they'll withhold information from you and even lie to you. Not because they're bad people, but because they're protecting themselves. They don't want to make a mistake. They don't want to look bad. Their process is also to always focus on price. Even in my business, I find people always ask right up front, and I'm sure probably in your business too, can you give me an idea of what this is going to cost? Can you send me a quote or proposal? Oftentimes, your prospect is just fishing for information and new ideas. We're always giving them free information. We're oftentimes a little bit too quick to give up stuff. As you know too, often we're hurrying up and then we're waiting. And often the prospect is not really flexible about next steps. We have to kind of follow along and do whatever they want. So your process, ideally, could be generally described. The first part for me is always an upfront frame. So for every conversation we're having, I want to clarify what the intent is for the conversation and what we want to do. I want to find ways to take control without being on the defensive. I don't want to perform and dance for them. I don't want to be rude. I don't want to seem overly controlling, but I do right up front want to give them a sense of my intention and my understanding of what we're going to talk about and what we're going to share with them, and also that we're going to ask them some questions. And then at the end of our conversation, it should be pretty clear what the next step is. So when I frame things like that right up front, I find that it relaxes people and it changes the whole dynamic of the conversation. As a part of our process, we've discussed before, we've got to paint a picture of what our value is, our unique value in the context of their world. Why people buy from us, what's going on for them. Paint a nice, clear little picture. We don't have to try to convince them or tell them how awesome we are. We can just talk about what an ideal client looks like for us, why people buy from us. We've got to uncover some sort of compelling reason to change. If they're talking about what their pain is or what the opportunity is, in a perfect world, we're monetizing that, meaning, what's the cost of that? And there can be a financial cost to their pain or missed opportunity. There can also be an intangible cost. They can be worried about losing their job or looking bad or just stressed out. Ideally, we're finding ways to monetize the pain and opportunity. One of the hardest things to do and to navigate is to identify all of the decision makers and then figure out what our next steps are. In my experience, and I'm sure in yours, sometimes our champion is not the ultimate decision maker. So they take all our stuff and they go present it, and they don't do a great job of presenting it, and then the whole deal falls apart. There are very specific times and situations where, as a part of our process, as a part of your process, we have to do a better job of suggesting a next step, which is having a conversation with another person or other persons before we get to the final step, to make sure that we understand what matters to them. And then finally, it's our job to lead or at least to negotiate next steps. So I'll use words like, as a part of our process, what we find works best. I'm going to always suggest some next steps or at least some options. At this point, we have a couple of options. So for me, if we're going to lead, there's a way to lead and make suggestions without seeming overly controlling. I'm sounding very reasonable, I'm sounding clear and confident, and I'm making suggestions about what I find works best, with the highest of intent of seeing if we're a good fit. So a couple of things to think about. This is more for you to think about as you get back to the office or get back to work or are working together with your peers or your team. Think about, when are we flexible? When are the times that we're going to be flexible about certain parts of our process? And when at some point are we not going to be flexible? That we're going to respectfully not be flexible about what this next step is and willing to actually respectfully and kindly walk away. You've heard me say the phrase, what we find works best. So as a part of our process, or what we find works best, is a really nice way to actually push back on them respectfully without appearing rude and having them follow us. The final point here is to slow things down. So often we move or want to move too fast. Even our prospect will want us to move quickly and will think, man, this is almost too good to be true. I'm going to follow along. Let's just accelerate this thing and we can skip a couple of steps. And in my experience, and probably yours, when we move too quickly, it almost never works. Or we move super fast and then all of a sudden things stall. If we can do a better job of being disciplined about taking a couple of extra steps before we get to the end of our process, I find that we'll accelerate things and our closing percentage will go way up. So notice within your RFP or quoting process when you're going to be flexible, what you find works best, and how you might slow things down and have an extra conversation before you just jump to proposal. And when they ask you for price, the first answer for me when they ask me for price is, I don't know. I could give them a price, but I don't know enough about what they need. I don't know enough about who else cares. I don't know enough about any compelling reason to change, what their pain is. So if they're going to ask me for pricing or a quote right up front, or even just to send them stuff, to send them information and materials, my first answer is, I don't know enough to know what to send you. So what I find works best is, let's schedule a brief conversation, 10 or 15 minutes, and then at that point in time we can decide what's next, or I can send you things that are actually most relevant. This is a very reasonable thing to suggest, and I find almost always a reasonable prospect or client will follow along with that. So this is just one example. So there are hundreds of examples of how to apply this that we don't have time to get into right now. I have more in the book, and we can talk about offline if you like. This is an example that happened recently where a client of mine reached out to a prospect, and the prospect responded and said, hi, can you send me some materials so I can review? Okay, that happens to all of us. We get a response and they ask us to send them something. And the first reaction is like, oh my gosh, I got a response, that's awesome. They want some of my stuff. I'm going to go ahead and send it right over and then hope that it's compelling enough that they agree to a conversation. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. If you respond to this directly by sending them stuff, your close percentage and your chance of this not stalling, your close percentage will go specifically very much lower, and deals will be much more apt to stall. So here's an example. I'll give you just a quick second to read. This is an example of the email follow-up to this particular request. So basically, this is an example of what I already had said. Yes, I can send you information. At this point, I don't know enough. What I find works best, let's have a really brief conversation, and then we can decide what makes sense moving forward. Very reasonable. I'm pushing back. I'm not giving them what they want. However, I am suggesting them a next step, and then at that point, I can see if I can get them what they want. Now, our ego mind is afraid they're going to think we're rude, or they're going to get mad if we don't just give them what they want, or we're going to lose the opportunity. In my experience, that is not true. And by the way, if they deny us on this request, or if they think that we're rude, they were going to be a really bad client anyway. This is a quote for me. This really is about intent, right? So I'm interested in, what is my intent? If my intent is just to close the business or make things happen, that's not enough. At some level, I do have to also have some high intent of solving problems and of helping people. I'm facilitating a process to find out if we're a good fit or not. Doesn't mean that I don't want to get more business. Doesn't mean that I don't want to make money. Doesn't mean that I don't want to close things and that I'm not competitive and want to win. However, my competitiveness and excitement does not give me a better chance of closing the business unless I also have high intent and I'm being thoughtful and I'm facilitating a process that I know will actually help them, give them a better chance of getting their problem solved and getting their needs met. Couple of quick reminders and tips for shortening the sales cycle. Clarify your intent for every conversation right up front. Think about it. What's my intent for this conversation? Secondly, like we just gave an example of, acknowledge their initial request. Oftentimes I'll then say, I don't know, and then I'll suggest a specific alternate next step. Focus on being curious. Remember those 5 key questions. Uncover the answers to those things, and it'll be very clear what the next steps are in your process. At the end of every conversation, there might just be one clear next step, and oftentimes there's some options. At this point, we have a couple of options, and then you're suggesting and laying out what the options are. Like I've mentioned before, slow everything down. There's a book called Horse Sense for People by Monty Roberts, and he talks about slow is fast. If we slow things down initially, take an extra step, ask an extra question, when we get towards the end, things will actually speed up to our advantage. So it's counterintuitive when we're selling and pushing, and even when our prospect wants to move quickly, it's counterintuitive to slow things down. I want to be appropriately skeptical, and I want to try to slow things down. So we covered their process, your process, where your prospect can break down, and also some ideas to shorten your sales cycle. So cut and paste some examples and some reminders from the homepage link. Also, pick a couple of situations where you can try this, especially when people are initially asking you to send them something or to give you pricing or to hurry up. Practice pushing back a little bit in an appropriate, very reasonable way. Send me any questions or results, and then click at the top of your browser to get back to the home page for the next module, and also to copy and paste or print out any of our key slides.